For over 50 years, one story has defined the end of the world's greatest band, the rivalry between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. It's a narrative we all think we know, a clash of ego and creative philosophy that tore apart the most influential musical force of the 20th century. We see it in the competing solo albums, the bitter press interviews, the lyrical pot shots, Lennon versus McCartney. It's the story that gets all the attention, but it isn't the whole truth. It might not even be the most important part of the truth. The partnership that truly fractured the Beatles, the one that festered with quiet resentment and open frustration, was between the bandmate who demanded perfection and the one who was pushed to his absolute limit. This is the story of how the quiet Beatle, George Harrison, grew to resent Paul McCartney. It's a tale not of two equals fighting for the crown, but of a slow-burning fire, consistently stoked by what felt like condescension, creative suffocation, and the unshakable air of an older brother who just couldn't see his younger sibling as a peer. This feud didn't just simmer, it boiled over, changing music history forever. To truly understand the end of the Beatles, you have to look past the shouting match between John and Paul and focus on the quiet, simmering anger of George Harrison. The mythology of the Beatles is built on partnerships, none more famous than Lennon and McCartney. But beneath that, another more complicated relationship was taking shape, one that started in boyhood friendship and would curdle into profound professional antagonism. George Harrison and Paul McCartney were, in many ways, the closest of any two Beatles before the fame. They met as schoolboys on a bus in Liverpool. McCartney, a year older, bonded with the younger Harrison over a shared obsession with the guitar. It was Paul who later championed George, introducing him to a skeptical John Lennon, who initially dismissed Harrison as too young to join his band, the Quarrymen. But Paul persisted, and George's flawless performance of the instrumental Raunchy on the top deck of a bus secured his spot. In those early days, they were inseparable, but that one-year age gap would cast a long, suffocating shadow. Paul, himself later admitted, I tended to talk down to him because he was a year younger. It was a seemingly innocent dynamic, but in George's mind, it solidified into a permanent hierarchy. He felt that even as they became world-famous adults, Paul still saw him as that kid brother, a junior partner who should be grateful for his place. This dynamic, seemingly harmless at first, would become a foundational crack in the Beatles' facade. As Beatlemania exploded, the Lennon-McCartney songwriting machine became the band's engine. George, the lead guitarist, was mostly seen as a gifted instrumentalist, and his own songwriting was often treated as an afterthought. While John and Paul churned out hits, George was lucky to get 1 or 2 songs per album. This wasn't necessarily malicious in the early years, but a result of unstoppable momentum. The industry, the fans, and even the band itself operated on the assumption that Lennon and McCartney were the designated geniuses. But friction was emerging. Recording engineer Norman Smith, who worked on Rubber Soul, noted that during those 1965 sessions, the clash between John and Paul was becoming obvious, and as far as Paul was concerned, George Harrison could do no right. Paul was absolutely finicky. It wasn't just about songwriting, it was about control. George found his guitar parts increasingly dictated to him, his instincts often steamrolled by Paul's meticulous vision. Paul would always help along when you'd done his 10 songs. Then when he got round to doing one of my songs, he would help, George later recalled. It was silly. It was very selfish, actually. The power dynamic shifted dramatically after the sudden death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in August 1967. Epstein had been the band's anchor and mediator. His death left a vacuum, and Paul McCartney stepped in to fill it. With John Lennon retreating into himself and his new relationship with Yoko Ono, Paul took the reins, determined to keep the Beatles moving forward. While his intention was likely to save the band, his methods were seen by the others, especially George, as intensely controlling. Paul himself acknowledged the shift in the Get Back documentary, saying, Daddy's gone away now, and we're on our own at the holiday camp. His attempt to impose that discipline, however, felt like a power grab. The older brother attitude was now magnified. From George's perspective, Paul was the director, and he was just an employee. The sessions for 1968's The Beatles, the White Album, became the point where these tensions erupted into open hostility. The studio was fractious, with each Beatle working in their own bubble. It was during these sessions that the creative friction between Paul and George became painfully clear. One well-known example was during the recording of Hey Jude. George suggested playing a guitar fill after each of Paul's vocal lines. Paul flatly rejected it, seeing it as an unnecessary flourish. To George, it was a dismissal of his musical input, reinforcing the idea that his ideas weren't welcome on a Paul song. This pattern of control was exhausting. Paul's obsessive perfectionism on his own songs, like Obla Di, Obla Da, which he reportedly made the band re-record endlessly, created a toxic environment. The band's longtime engineer, Jeff Emmerich, actually quit during these sessions, unable to stand the infighting. For George, the frustration was immense. He was writing prolifically, stockpiling songs that would later fill his monumental solo album, All Things Must Pass. Yet, in the Beatles, he had to fight for every inch of space on an album. The White Album sessions exposed an uncomfortable truth. Whatever creative democracy had existed was crumbling, and George was tired of his position at the bottom of Phi. The hierarchy. If the White Album created the fissures, the Get Back sessions in January 1969 were the earthquake. Paul's idea was to return to their roots, rehearsing new material for a TV special, all captured on film. For George, this was a nightmare. He had just returned from America, collaborating with musicians like Bob Dylan and the band, and experiencing a creative freedom that was the polar opposite of the cold, monitored environment of Twickenham Film Studios. Returning to what he called the winter of discontent with the Beatles was, for him, very unhealthy and unhappy. The setting was bleak and the tension was immediate. Paul, as project leader, was more exacting than ever. John was largely disengaged, often with Yoko Ono by his side, whose constant presence irritated George. This left George feeling cornered, facing Paul's micromanagement without backup. The conflict came to a head in a now infamous exchange caught on film. While rehearsing Two of Us, Paul began to meticulously pick apart George's guitar part. George, his patience gone, finally snapped. With quiet, seething anger, he delivered a line that summed up years of frustration. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was a moment of bitter surrender, the sound of a man who was creatively suffocated. The final straw came on January 10th, 1969. After a morning of tense rehearsals and reportedly a heated argument, George Harisson calmly announced he was leaving the band. When a surprised John asked, "When?" George snapped back, "Now. See you around the clubs." His diary entry for the day was brutally simple. Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home. He had just walked out on the biggest band in the world. He drove home and channeled his frustration into a new song, Wah Wah. Harisson later explained the term was his shorthand for the oppressive, headache-inducing negativity he felt. The song's lyrics reflect his feeling of being smothered by the egos and bad vibes in the room. While aimed at the general atmosphere, including John's detachment and Yoko's presence, the conflict with Paul was a major catalyst. It was a declaration of independence that would become a cornerstone of All Things Must Pass, an album that served as an explosive release of his suppressed creative energy. George's departure sent a shockwave through the band. After a few days, they held a meeting where George agreed to return, but on his terms. The live show was scrapped, and the sessions moved to their own, more intimate Apple Studios. To keep the peace, George brought in an outside musician, keyboardist Billy Preston. Preston's friendly presence had a calming effect, forcing the others to be on their best behavior. But it was a fragile truce. The underlying issues hadn't been resolved. The fight and the song it inspired were a terminal diagnosis. The Beatles, as a functioning partnership, were dying, and the deep chasm between George and Paul was a primary cause. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, George Harrison was already liberated. His first post-Beatles album, All Things, Must Pass, was a triple LP masterpiece, the sound of a dam breaking. Filled with songs he had stockpiled for years, its success was a profound validation, proving he was a world-class songwriter who had finally stepped out of the shadows. The wounds, however, remained. In a 1974 press conference, he famously said, "I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but I couldn't join a band with Paul McCartney, but it's nothing personal." Of course, it was deeply personal. George's resentment often showed up as dry, cutting wit. When Paul released his 1984 film Give My Regards to Broad Street, which featured re-recordings of Beatles songs, George was asked what he thought. He quipped that he couldn't understand why Paul would re-record old songs, musing, "Makes me think it must be because he got the publishing of it or something." Throughout the 70s and 80s, their relationship remained strained. George seemed to enjoy pricking Paul's pomposity, as one observer noted, treating him like an overbearing older brother who needed to be taken down a peg. The tragic death of John Lennon in 1980 brought a slight thaw. They collaborated on George's tribute to John, All Those Years Ago, which also featured Ringo Starr. A more significant reconciliation came in the mid-1990s with the Beatles Anthology project. The surviving members reunited to complete 2 unfinished John Lennon demos. While the documentary series presented a mostly united front, flashes of the old dynamic were still visible. According to reports, Paul wanted the Threedles to record Let It Be. But George vetoed the idea, a small but telling act of asserting his will after decades of feeling sidelined. The scars, it was clear, hadn't fully healed. As the years passed, a deeper peace finally settled between them. In 2001, as George faced his final battle with cancer, the two men found their way back to the friendship they had started as schoolboys. Paul would visit George, and they would sit together not as rivals, but as old friends. "We held hands," Paul recalled. "It's funny, even at the height of our friendship, you would never hold hands. But it was lovely." In a gesture of this final reconciliation, Paul allowed George and his family to stay at his home in Los Angeles during George's final days for privacy and peace. When George passed away, a devastated Paul spoke to the press. "He's a lovely man. I love him dearly," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I grew up with him. He's like a baby brother to me." Years later, Paul shared that a tree George had given him as a gift serves as a constant living reminder of his friend. So, what is the final truth? The story of George and Paul is not a simple one of hate. It's a story of a deep friendship, eroded by fame and a complex creative partnership. Everyone assumes the great rivalry was between the two titans, Lennon and McCartney. But the feud that truly fractured the Beatles was the one that simmered in the shadows for years. The breakup was caused by many factors. Business disputes, John's disengagement, and managerial chaos were all huge. But the consistent, years-long decay of the relationship between George and Paul made that collapse inevitable. Paul's need to lead clashed directly with George's need for creative freedom, the very dynamic that Paul likely believed was saving. The Beatles was, from George's perspective, the very thing destroying it. This conflict wasn't just a symptom of the breakup. It was the slow, personal tragedy at the heart of the greatest band in history. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden stories and complex relationships behind the world's greatest bands, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell, and let us know in the comments. Which song from All Things Must Pass do you think best expresses George's feelings about leaving the Beatles?